This is the story of a lost neighborhood and of its people who did not want to go.
I don't want no money. I want my home. The old man is old. See how the old man is old? And I'm old. That's enough. I don't want to get out. I said to my two daughters, they don't want to get out too because they spend a lot of money. Plenty of money they spend in this place. You're not getting out to nobody. Never.
Hi, welcome to the West End Video Newsletter. Tonight we have with us Ed Flynn. He's the son of former Mayor Ray Flynn, who I still think is a great guy. And he did quite a bit for the West End when we were in Boston. He formulated a lot of policy that helped us. Unfortunately, after he left, a lot of that policy was thrown into the bucket, and we ended up on the short end of it. But be that as may, Ed Flynn is here tonight, and I'll tell you what happened. We were at St. Joseph's Church, and we were having our annual the Mass for the deceased West Enders, and Ed came down, and I thought that was a great on his part that he would come down, you know, a local West End, because a lot of people forget about us, but we still act like a neighborhood. We just don't have buildings. And Ed came in, and we were talking. I said, "Why don't you come on the show Wednesday?" And I really feel you know, proud to have him here, because I think, let me explain a little bit, that he did his college thesis on the West End, and him and his father have always been great supporters of the West End, although they have no West End ties, so I feel that makes them honorary West Enders. If you're going to do something for somebody and you really don't have to, then it's all encompassing. We accept him, and we think that Edna's father, honorary West Enders.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for having me, and it was good to see you and to see the other folks at St. Joseph's Church last Sunday in the West End. It was good to talk to some of the people about the old West End stories. I could listen to them all night, just talking about the old neighborhood. It reminds me of my neighborhood in South Boston, or other neighborhoods in Roxbury or Dorchester, throughout the city. But it was a nice Mass, and it was just a lovely event after Mass, and thank you for asking me to be on the show. I appreciate that.
Without a doubt. Well, interesting people, and you, like I say, you're like you've shown interest in the West End. You did your thesis, and every so often your father calls me up and we talk on the radio show, and you know, I have great feelings for him. I really thought he went all out for us. Okay, and I appreciate that. Like I say, other administrations haven't been as kind to us, okay, but the Flynn administration was. Actually, the Flynn administration, and I do a talk every year at MIT on to urban planners, master students in urban planning, and the only time that eminent domain and urban renewal was given to the private sector, and well, a non-profit sector, was Dudley Square Initiative. Your father gave, or it's your father's administration gave the Dudley Square Initiative eminent domain powers. That's the only time I ever heard of that ever happening anywhere in the United States. It may have happened somewhere else, but it's so infrequent that I've never heard of it.
Right.
And I thought that was a great thing.
Yeah, as you said, I did my thesis in college, a research term paper on the West End, and I had the opportunity to speak to you and speak to other old West Enders and do some research about it, but just the way the city treated its citizens, its needy citizens, was unconscionable, in my opinion. I think, you know, community involvement, there was virtually no community involvement. What the city did was basically tear down in 59, 60, 61, this working class, low-income area made up of strong ethnic families, probably the most diverse neighborhood you probably could have in the country. I think at one time there was 23 different ethnic groups in the West End. There was Irish and Italians and Polish and Lithuanians, Syrians, and I remember my father telling me one time he was playing basketball at the old West End house.
Yeah.
And there was 10 guys playing basketball, and they were all from different backgrounds. There was an Irish kid and a Polish kid and a black kid and a Jewish kid. And
the black kid, I think, was Eldie Moore. I hung around with his brother, Sonny, for a lot of years.
Right. And everyone got along very well, and it was just a great neighborhood. And unfortunately, the city of Boston in '59, and under the guise of urban renewal,
that's right.
Decided to take out this working class, low-income families and build this luxury condominiums right at the old West End now, where the Rappaport facility is. If you lived here, you'd be home now, right in the Charles River.
Right.
And so I think that's probably, not only it's one of the biggest events, I think, in Boston's history, it's probably one of its worst events in Boston's history as well.
It was voted when Channel 5 did the 100 worst, the 100 things that affected Boston history. I think it was the 60th. That's a lot of history.
That's right. That's right.
It was the 60th. The West End being torn down was the 60th event that affected Boston history.
Right.
So,
and it reminds me a lot of, as I was saying, of South Boston. Right. It's, a lot of people, I know South Boston's a different community now, but at one time it was obviously it's a big Irish community, but it was a big Polish community. I think it had the third or the fourth largest Polish community outside of Poland.
Well, actually, my mother came in through Lithuania. I mean, my mother was Lithuanian.
Right.
She came in through Lithuania because she was Lithuanian, but she came in through South Boston. My mother lived in South Boston when she came to this country, her and her family. They eventually moved up to Haverhill. Okay. But they started off in South.
Okay. Actually, my entire family, my brother and my 4 sisters went to St. Peter's Lithuanian School in South Boston. It's on 6th Street, and they actually have a Lithuanian church in D Street in the public housing developments in South Boston. And we would have we would go to church there on Sunday, and they'd have a beautiful May procession. But South Boston, again, had a big Lithuanian community, and I know a lot of them now have moved south. There's a lot of them in Brockton and Stoughton and those areas, but there's also a big Armenian community in South Boston, Albanian community.
Peter Galzinis is Lithuanian.
Right, Peter's also active at St. Augustine's Catholic Church in South Boston. Actually, at one time, I think, it was in the late 70s, they did a study out, U.S. News and World Report, that South Boston was the poorest white community in the United States. But it was that area of St. Augustine's where actually I live now is Gold Street, and a lot of the public housing, Old Colony and D Street public housing. So there's a lot of South Boston, again, it's a lot of low-income families struggling to support their families. They're doing a good job, but they are struggling, but they're doing well, and they're a great asset to not only to the city, but probably to the country, I think.
Well, somewhere in the 50s, they decided that low-income people that lived in these housing, that lived in these areas, with low-cost housing, it was no good for them, and that they should be all rounded up and put into projects or whatever. And it was a totally false premise, because all these people who lived there, it gave you low-cost housing. I mean, today, like the North End is gentrified out of existence.
Right.
And if the West End was up, I don't want to tell anybody that the West End would still be a viable community that it was in 1950. It probably would have been gentrified even before that, because we're on the foot of Beacon Hill.
Right.
And it probably would have been swept out even before the North End and the South End.
Right.
And now South Boston is going out. I understand. I heard the last I heard that South Boston only about 60% pre 4 years ago community.
That's accurate. It's a different town, South Boston, than it was 10 years ago. It's more of a upper income group of people, well educated, that work in the Fidelities and the banks and the
close to Boston
and big businesses.
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of the long-time South Boston families, second generation, third generation families, young people starting out getting married, and they're 25 or 30 years old, they can't afford to live in the town anymore.
That's true.
And it's happening over in
It's happening here in Somerville, too.
That's right.
I live in Davis Square. If I didn't own the house that I bought 30 years ago, I'd be gone. I'd be out of here. I couldn't afford the rents. The rents have gone skyrocketing, and I have no idea how anybody can afford it. Of course, there's a lot of people that, you know, they'll work in Boston and they'll share an apartment with somebody and share the rent. So it tends to work out.
Yeah.
And I'm not complaining because it raises the value of my house, but I sort of missed having a viable community around me that was more blue collar and. See, when I sit in a bar like in Southie or one of these places, I communicate because you understand. It's just like you. I can talk to you, and I think you'll understand whatever I'm talking about because we've been through, even though we grew up in different areas, right? We sort of went through the basic trading, okay? The same basic things, okay? And if you talk to somebody from an area like of a blue collar. They know what you're talking about. You know what they're talking about. It's all changed. I don't know if there will be any blue-collar workers anymore. Most of the jobs that are for blue-collars are slowly ebbing out too.
That's right. Yeah, it's all throughout the city of Boston, housing is very expensive.
Right.
It's difficult for working families to continue raising their family in Boston and Boston's neighborhoods. And it's too bad. I think something needs to be done to ensure that working families have the opportunity to live in a neighborhood that they grew up in, that the grandparents are from, that they went to school at, and they can work at, and they can be part of the community organizations and PTA and Knights of Columbus and youth sports programs. I think we're missing a lot of that in the city
even
now.
more than that, just sitting on the corner and talking to people.
Right.
And nobody does that in what's called, the upscale neighborhoods. They don't sit outside and talk to their neighbor and smooth down and get an ice cream cone or something, and everybody gathers on the corner and they talk about whatever the local neighborhood gossip is. We had Al Lupo on the show once, and I still remember that. He was talking about the old days of the 3 decades, like in East Boston, Southie, West End, all the West End were all tenements. He says, in the old days, he says, the way you'd get your news was somebody from the end of this block on a porch in the back of a three family would yell over to a next door neighbor, and it would go all the way down the block. He says, of course, sometimes by the end of it, it wasn't the same story.
Yeah, it'd be a different story, right.
Yeah.
That's still, there's still that type of community involvement in South Boston and probably other neighborhoods as well. I talk often to a good friend of mine in the North End, Bob DeCristoforo. He actually just, his mother passed away a while back. It was a great lady. But, Bob was telling me that things have changed drastically in the North End, but there is still a group of people that, pockets, and a lot of it is the elderly that are still there. Unfortunately, a lot of the young people have moved out. He was telling me that a lot of the people have moved to Medford and Malden and towns up in the North Shore.
In the old days, there was the theory that if you lived in the North End and the West End, you couldn't afford to move anywhere else. And in the West End, some of that was true, but a lot of the people that lived there could well afford to move out of the West End, and they never did because there were online Yankees that had trust funds that were living in the West End.
Right.
Okay. And they weren't living there because they couldn't afford to get out.
Right.
They were living there because they enjoyed living in the West End. You enjoyed the, I hate to say diversity because, it wasn't planned diversity. It just happened and everybody just seemed to get along. I think what happens is as long as you have diversity that comes up from the people, it works.
Right.
It's when you try to put diversity from the top down that it doesn't work. Look at I think we were talking about this before the show started, and we were talking about how I used to go down to South Boston in the old days, and we'd have a few drinks in the bars because some of my friends were in the Army with kids from South Boston, and. If you said anything about a black person, they used to get mad. They used to say, those people were, treated badly, blah, 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 blah. They seemed to complete change after busing.
Right.
After busing, it was like, my.
Yeah, it was obviously a difficult time in the city with the integration of the school systems.
Well, when you force people together, it doesn't work. I guess that's why I brought that up, is that as long as you're doing it from top down, it seems to make, what you're doing is squashing people together. When they come from the bottom up, they seem to grow together, and it seems to work. But from top down, I don't think it works. All I think it creates is animosity.
Right, right, that's true. I know you were mentioning the veterans, and I know South Boston is actually dedicating a monument very soon to the World War II veterans, and I know your family have paid a big price for your service to your country. And
my brother.
Your brother passed away.
Died in Italy in 1944.
Right.
Actually, it was sort of tragic because one of his buddies came back to my house, and what he said was that they were pulling back. And he died in October, I forgot exactly, 20-something. And they were pulling back from the lines. They were going back into winter, whatever they call it, winter retreat, or whatever it was. And one of his buddies stepped on a mine and it took them both out. So it was like unfortunate, really unfortunate, because 6 months later the war was over, but he happened to give his life. And what sort of bothers me, is when they tore the West End down, they not only tore down the buildings, they tore down all the war monuments to those people. They tore it down, and the only places that you have anything that celebrates West Enders who gave their life or served in the military in the Second World War, or even the Korean War. My brother was in the Korean, over in Korea. He survived it, but he was in Korea in the 50s, and there are no monuments to those people.
Right. I know the city of Boston has a very good veterans program. The commissioner there is Tom Matarazzo, who does a great job. But that's something we should probably look into and see what the city's obligation would be to assist some of these veterans that paid the ultimate price.
I checked one time, and what they told me was that if I went out and found somebody to design it, and they would approve it, but I'd have to raise the money for them and the whole thing. And I find that sort of offensive, because when they tore it down, they weren't looking for any of those things.
My neighborhood of South Boston had more young men that went off to Vietnam than any town in the country. And we actually dedicated the first monument ever, which was very controversial at the time, right at M Street Park, which now is called Medal of Honor Park. It was they just rededicated it a month ago. But there are a lot of great families in Boston that paid a huge price for our freedom today, and reflecting on the events of September 11th. I think we need to do more to help our veterans, especially our older veterans, with their pensions, with their health care. I know the VA now is closing down,
all over the place,
cutting services in Jamaica Plain in the West Roxbury area for veterans.
Is that going?
And then moving them out towards Brockton and south of Boston.
There was one down in Brockton.
I think it's unfair to ask people to serve in the military, and they do their part. They do what the government asks them to do, and they do it with honor. And then when they're getting older, they're sick, and they're at an older age, the government turns their back on them. It's too bad.
Well, unfortunately, blue-collar, working-class neighborhoods are usually the ones that fight the wars. Because in well-to-do neighborhoods, they become officers, and they have people that can call people, and they talk to each other. Working-class neighborhood people have that attitude: if you hit back, right? And they're not scared to go over and do it and fight, and they figure it's their duty to do it. Of course, I don't know how much of that is true anymore, because I don't know how many working-class neighborhoods are left. I mean, but in the old days, that was, you felt that you had to go and do it, because I'll tell you a story. There was this in the Korean War. Joe Matarazzo. A friend of mine was in the Army for like 8 years, and we were going around drinking. We stopped in one of the bars down that station, and we ran into this guy, and we were talking to him, and he won the Silver Star in Korea. When the Chinese came over the border? Him and a lieutenant and another guy held off on one of the ridges, held off a battalion of Chinese while the rest of the company bugged out and got back. They gave them all the Silver Star. They probably would have got the Congressional Medal of Honor, but you need an officer witnessing the the action, that isn't of the part of it. And so my buddy kept telling him, how come you didn't run? How come you didn't run? Right? He says, I can't tell you. If I tell you, you'll laugh at me. So he kept pushing. He said, we're all drinking. He said, if I tell you, you'll laugh at me. Finally, he goes, all right, I'll tell you. But he says, I don't want you laughing at me.
Yeah.
He says, I didn't run because if I ran, he says, the guys in the corner would think I was a coward.
Yeah.
And
Right.
if you think about that,
Right.
you think about the amount of peer pressure that is on a guy
Right.
from Southie, from the West End, the North End, even the South End, right?
Right.
And that era, because now all these eras is gentrified, and I don't think you'll find that anymore.
Right.
But the amount of peer pressure.
You're right, Jim. I'm a member of the Navy Reserves,
Right.
so I'm an active drilling reservist. I've been in since high school, since I graduated from high school in '87. But meeting many people, thousands of people in my career, I'm still in. But I think we are, extremely lucky to have some of the folks in there now. I just got back from California. They did a wargaming experiment out there, out in San Diego, Camp Pendleton. And it was a lot of the high-tech equipment that they are using, and it's really not the hand-to-hand combat. Although you will see that eventually in a war like Iraq. What they'll probably do is to do a lot of air attacks and then
soften it up.
Yeah, and then come in with the ground troops.
The ground troops.
The other thing is obviously the medical care
Right.
that should stay with you until the day you die. Even if you did 2 years or 4 years. I think that.
Well, isn't that the VA stuff? Isn't that have a what do you call it? A cost. I mean, if you're a salary tied into your salary, if you're making too much, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't afford it.
There,
I mean, you can't avail yourself of it.
And recently, a lot of those services are starting to be phased out, and they phase them out by simply moving a VA clinic out of a neighborhood. So a guy from Charlestown that went to get his care right near the old Boston Garden there on Causeway Street.
That's right.
And now has to go to down to Newport, Rhode Island. Just as an example. So instead of basically walking from Charlestown to the old Boston Garden area, he now has to find a way to get to Newport, which is difficult. So basically, what they did is they.
I think that's a result of gentrification too.
Right.
I think it's another form of gentrification. These places, the property becomes too expensive. Even if the state or the government owns it, they decide to sell it and take the money.
Right.
And they figure they can use it somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah. So, we're coming to the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Well, thank you for having me on as a guest. I appreciate the offer and the invitation. It's good to be here with you. I actually have been here several times, not on air,
That's right.
but in the back when my father was speaking.
Right. And your father's always got an open invitation.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
always got an open.
He enjoys being here. He said to say hello, and he wanted to thank you for all that you've done to make Boston a better city, and actually to make this a better country. And you've given a lot to this country, and we're proud to have people like you, and people that are hardworking. They're supporting their family, they're involved in their community, and a lot of people are struggling. The days of daily life and the struggles of daily life. It impacts everybody. It impacts me. It impacts you, and. But you've paid a big price, and I just want to thank you for your friendship and for making this a better city.
Like I say, your father treated us quite well when he was mayor, okay? And for that, I respect him forever. A lot of people, when somebody, loses their political office, and you must know this.
Right, yeah.
You don't see anymore.
Yeah, right.
All of a sudden, they disappear.
Yeah, those phone calls are not returned anymore. Yeah. So it's a tough business, but.
Yeah. But that's one thing about most neighborhood people.
Right.
Okay? Most neighborhood people, if you did right by me, they'll do right by you.
Right.
Okay? And you always have that in the, you go down the North End, if people treated you right there, you treat them right. South Boston, they treat you right, you treat them right. Matter of fact, even if, in the old days, even if you fought with them,
right.
Okay. Afterwards, you became friends, and a lot of times you became even closer friends to people you fought with.
Right. That's true.
Than you didn't.
Right.
I mean, so there was, and there was a camaraderie that, you know, anything happened, you'd always be together. There was this bond.
Right.
I mean, I don't see that bond anymore. I
No.
don't feel it, and I don't see it
Right.
out there anymore.
Right. I think we both have similar philosophies of, not of government, just of being people, of helping people when they're down in their luck, and people that are struggling, we want to be there to give them a hand.
Well, the new neighborhoods, the gentrified neighborhoods, they think that in the old days you'd bring over, you know, somebody got sick, you'd bring them over soup. They think if you bring them over soup now, that they're being friendly, and they are.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's the end of it with them.
Right.
And okay,
Right.
in the old days, bringing over soup was symptomatic. I mean, that was the end of the, whatever you were doing, not the start of it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Right. I do.
In other words,
Right.
okay, and there is a feel to every neighborhood. And
Right.
let me tell you, when I left the West End, I played football out in the North End for about, and I hung out in the North End for about 8 years. And a great neighborhood, don't get me wrong.
Right.
I'm not trying to diminish them in any way, but it was different. Okay, Southie, same thing. You go down there, great neighborhood, but it was different.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
There's a different feel to each one of these neighborhoods. I'm not saying that you know, anyone's better than the other, but each one is different.
Right.
Okay, and but in a way they're all the same.
Right. It's working class, working families of Boston, and there's
Right.
probably 21 or 22 of these neighborhoods, and they each make a huge impact to make the city a better place to live in,
That's right.
to raise a family.
And as long as you interact with your neighbors, okay, not just on a personal level, but on an emotional level, okay, like it's easy enough to talk to them. A lot of people think because you talk to your neighborhood, but you know, it's really hard to explain the way neighborhoods were in the 40s or 50s, okay, because I don't think most people would understand
Right.
how it works. Southie probably would, because I think Southie up until now has been, North End was up until about 20 years ago or 10 years ago, whenever it started,
Right.
whenever Faneuil Hall started that ebb tide.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that drove a lot of
Yeah.
families out of that area.
Oh, without a doubt.
And you know, the North End is it's a great place, but unfortunately, a lot of people have moved out throughout the city actually because of the skyrocket price of housing. And there's very little housing for working families in the city.
There's nowhere downtown where you can actually go and, you know, get cheap rents anymore.
Right.
I mean, I'll tell you, you know what surprised me? A friend of mine, his mother died. He was a black kid, and his mother was black, and I was going out to Dorchester to go to the wake. And I hadn't driven down Mass Ave, okay, through the South End for years.
Right.
And I was riding through there, and what totally shocked me was I seen white people all over the place.
Right.
Before it used to be a black area.
Yeah, that's right. Now it's
I didn't really see black people, and it's not, you know, I'm not trying to make a class issue with this.
Right.
But just to show that, you know, the way things have,
right.
In the South End are moving out.
It's a different city, and I think throughout the city, it's a lot of new people that have moved in, and they're working in the banks and the financial industries. But unfortunately, long-time Boston people, second generation, third generation, are just unable to afford to live in the city and raise their family and go to school here.
And when they move out, they become part of the problem, because they grow up in areas where they don't have that same support system and everything. So they grow up not knowing what it is, and they grow up like the rest of the neighborhoods. And in that sense of the neighborhoods, they're dying, and they'll probably be, it'll probably be over shortly in the next couple of years. Well, that's it, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Jim.
I
Thank you for
appreciate
having me. It was a pleasure.
And see you at the next West End video newsletter.